Deputy Speaker Mihail Popșoi, thank you for joining me today. I really appreciate you taking the time to talk about Moldovan politics and just kind of the recent developments in politics here in Moldova. I find it really interesting, so I'm hoping that you can kind of, so much has happened, I hope that maybe you can provide some clarity to some of the nuances that have occurred over the last year. You have an extensive background. You have master's degrees and doctor's degrees in political science. You've worked with think tanks in the U.S. and you've done a lot of work here with the NATO Documentation Center and the U.S. Embassy. But to start off with, for those who may not be familiar with Moldovan politics quite as much, could you maybe give a timeline of the last year because so much has happened?
Sure, but before I need to correct you a bit, I don't quite yet have a PhD. I'm far behind my PhD writing thesis. I was supposed to defend it in September, but I took a year extension because this past year was a bit hectic.
Yes.
And hopefully I can finish it by the end of next year because it would be rather unfortunate to not finalize that project because I've spent quite a lot of time on that at the University of Milan. And I do have 2 masters in American Studies and European Public Policy. With regards to last year, well, it has been quite rocky indeed. Perhaps I should start with the parliamentary election with February, or perhaps even before that. We've had a situation in which the ruling party, the ruling regime as we called it, and Plahotniuc, the oligarch, he was changing the laws, he was changing the system to fit his interests. He changed the electoral system prior to the election together with the socialists to benefit his party, the mixed electoral system like the one they have in Georgia, which benefits the bigger parties, the parties that can rely on administrative resources, money basically, buying votes in the districts. It's easier. But nonetheless, we had 26 seats, the socialists had 35, the Democrats had 30, but if you count the independents and the Shore party, or the Kroll party as we call it for the Kroll report, Plahotniuc had close to 40 seats.
And just to clarify, when you said we, you're the ACUM, right?
ACUM, yes, the electoral bloc ACUM, formed of 2 political parties, Action and Solidarity Party and the Dignity and Truth political party. We had 26 seats, and we managed, after painful 3 months following the February election, to build some bridges and to build some trust with the socialists, which was incredibly painful, and we now see why. After 5 months of governing, it was perhaps somewhat naive to think that a relationship with the socialists, a governing relationship, could last longer. I mean, we were not that naive to think that it would last longer than a year, because the presidential election would have been this litmus test for Dodon, and he would have most likely failed it. Well, he failed it much earlier. He figured out that he needs to basically get rid of his main opponent, or rather not allow Maya Sandu to be in a position of prime minister right before the election, because this would likely put her in a much better position. But also another point is that we've had local elections, and we were in a position to get about half ACUM bloc. I mean, we were in a position to get about half of the Rayon chairmanships, which is almost like the governorships in the US. I mean, not quite that, but that's the idea. The heads of the second layer of the local public administration. And the socialists would have gotten roughly the same. So the Democrats would have got virtually nothing. And that was probably even more naive to think that the Don would have given us half of the Rayon chairmanships in the country, would have given us such a strong presence on the ground in the local public administration right before this all-important election for him, the second term.
Do you mind me asking one clarifying question real quick? So you said that Plahotniuc installed a new electoral system, and I spoke with someone the other day on elections a little bit, and we were talking about how, is this the electoral system where each region has 1 representative in parliament, except for Gagauzi and Trăsnișu that have 2? So even though he is now kind of out, the electoral system that he instilled...
No, we canceled the electoral system with the socialists.
Oh, so now you have a different electoral system?
We returned to the fully proportional electoral system, like we've had before. But the problem is that there is a constitutional court ruling saying that if early elections occur, then it is mandated that they happen under the old system. That the change of the electoral system that we implemented this summer will only apply to the next regular election. That's the idea. So now what needs to happen is for the Constitutional Court to review its decision and to basically strike down that previous decision, which made no sense. So now there is also a question mark if and when elections happen, which system applies.
Okay, because one unique characteristic that I was talking with this individual with the other day was that Transnistria now had 2 parliamentary members.
Yes.
So would that still, and just because my research focuses a little bit on the dynamics here in Moldova with relation to Transnistria and Gagauzia, so I was wondering, would that be affected at all?
Yes. Under proportional system, they would have none, neither Gagauzia. Would be the same as...
That's the Platinuk system?
No, that's the current system. That's the system before Plahotniuc.
Okay, so the new system takes a little harsher view on Transnistria's involvement?
It's irrelevant to Transnistria. The electoral system, proportional system, is all people from the country vote in one constituency. Okay. The whole country is one constituency.
All right.
And political parties, or independent candidates for that matter, get seats in parliament strictly based proportional on the vote that they get. Simple, fair,
okay.
As opposed to having 2 seats on Transnistria. Why 2? There are more Moldovan citizens there than 120,000 that, in one constituency there were 60,000 voters, give or take.
Right.
So in Transnistria there are many more, but the even bigger question is the Moldovan diaspora. Because if you give Transnistria 2, then you need to give Moldovan diaspora 20. And they only gave, they only gave 1 to Europe and 1 to the US.
The ACUM is kind of a diaspora party to a lot like a...
Well, we do have overwhelming support in the diaspora just because people there are much better informed and they're not dependent on the clientelistic networks and they are not subject to media propaganda here.
Well, Moldova has a large diaspora, don't they?
Well, yes.
Unfortunately. Unfortunately, right.
Because it's not a diaspora that emigrated out of not having anything better to do and enjoying life abroad.
Necessity.
But they migrated out of sheer necessity. But nonetheless, they are quite an important power within the Moldovan economy. The remittances that they send to their relatives here are an important live stream in the economy, if not actually the backbone of the economy, because we still have a consumption-based economy. Mm-hmm. It's not an investment-based or industry-driven. It's just, to a large extent, remittances coming in and being spent, and then also international financial assistance, grants and credits.
Right.
Not very sustainable system, but that's what it is.
Okay, so I didn't mean to interrupt. I wanted to get some clarification on that. So back to the timeline. So you're saying...
So we had the election in February. It took us 3 months to build some bridges with the socialists, because you can imagine, or maybe you can't imagine, the sheer divide that was between us. We were staunchly pro-Western and still are and always will be. They were rather pro-Russian, let's put it this way.
Yes.
Have always been and will likely remain so.
Right.
Not because that they think that Russia provides a better alternative to the West in terms of economic development. It's just that they are beholden to Russia. And famously, Dodon has this video where he is talking to Plahotniuc in June, where he confesses to Plahotniuc that he's getting $700,000 per month from the Russians to finance his political party. Mm-hmm. So when you have that kind of
direct influence,
bondage, then it's rather difficult to take any other position than the position that your sponsor is suggesting to you.
It's a healthy incentive.
Yes, you can put it that way. So nonetheless, Plahotniuc was the biggest threat to Moldova in terms of development, human rights, rule of law. We were basically on verge of becoming a mafia state where he controlled all the resources. Mm-hmm. He had this iron-fisted control over the entire state apparatus, controlled all the money flows. So we were increasingly resembling a regime like in Azerbaijan or in Armenia before the revolution, or some Central Asian regimes, which we've never had before. I mean, we've had Voronin, but we've always had a healthy, pluralist society.
Right.
So now what we did, we took out Plahotniuc and we reintroduced this troublesome but healthy political pluralism. Dodon now is trying to change that. The temptations for him are rather high, and he has a hard time withstanding those temptations.
Mm-hmm.
And I mean, you could hardly blame him. I mean, well, of course you can, but it's just the reality of the nature of the game in Moldova. If you can take advantage of the system, mm-hmm. you have to have incredible, should I say, moral stamina to withstand that temptation.
Right.
Because if you can control the money flows, if you can take over the corrupt schemes, if you can take over, the state apparatus and extract rent from the public system and put pressure on private businesses to pay you mm-hmm. political rent as well. And on the one hand, if you can do that, on the other hand, if there is no disincentive for you to do that in the sense that you know that you'll pay harshly, that the law doesn't allow that, and you'll be caught doing that and you'll pay a price. Mm-hmm. If you know that is not the case, then there is only your internal moral compass that is stopping you from doing that.
Right. And
very few politicians in Moldova until now, other than perhaps Maya Sandu, and forgive me, but I'm biased here, of course.
Yes.
But you could also argue, based on her experience in government, her track record, and our track record as party members, that we're the only ones that had this moral compass and have proven to have had this moral compass. Whereas now we see that Dodon is moving along the path of basically copying Plahotniuc regime slightly in a lighter form, but then of course it can change rather quickly, because we remember Putin's regime in the early 2000s when he just came to power. It seemed like somewhat liberal, even pro-Western for the first few years, but then things changed, and then we had Medvedev, who also seemed like somewhat pro-Western, and there was this liberal detente, and then things shifted quite a bit. So, if politicians have the means to exploit the system to their advantage and don't have anything other than the internal moral compass and perhaps the moral compass of those who surround them to stop them from doing so, they will likely do that, unfortunately.
Okay, I do have a question, I guess a couple questions about Dodon. So when is the next presidential election?
End of next year.
End of next year?
December, January, something
and
like that.
How many terms? Has he only served one, or is it two now?
He's only served one term. He can only serve another second term. Okay.
And so you guys do have the two-term limit like we do? And so just to remain kind of a little objective, let me get your opinion. I have kind of noticed in the news a little bit that he had brought on a social services kind of liaison person, minister, and he's kind of doing a few things. So I was going to kind of ask, I know you have a lot of criticism of the government. Are there things that they are doing right and you're doing wrong? You said that they are kind of left-leaning right now, or not left-leaning, but they're being a little light, was I think the word you used.
No, I'm saying that he is now instrumental in creating a Plahotniuc-type regime, but in a just light form. Okay. It's a Plahotniuc light, right. Like Bud Light.
Right, I got you.
Okay. There are things that they are trying to do right, but that depends on their perspective of right. Mm-hmm. Now, if you look at the budget that they are approving, they are trying to have a spending spree, welfare spending.
Right, they're increasing the pension a little bit.
Yes, and then that's okay. We were going to do the same. Maya Sandu's budget was going to do the same. The only difference is that Maya Sandu's budget was balanced. Okay. And I mean, there was a deficit there, but there was there were the resources that would cover the deficit from Romania, from World Bank, from IMF, and there was about a 3 billion Moldovan currency deficit. These guys have a deficit of 7.4 billion, which is perhaps the largest in Moldovan history.
Okay. So I did notice that just passed, didn't they? Like yesterday or the day before, just passed the 2020 economic.
The budget, in the government.
So the numbers you're talking about are what you're seeing in that?
Yeah, so that's basically an electoral budget, just to give handouts to the voters, and basically after us the flood, that's the idea, because for him it's most important to win the election, and he can now provide the welfare spending as much as possible, just not to ruin the economy just now. After the election, after he wins, supposedly that's his plan, then he'll take care of it. That's the idea. The same with Plahotniuk in the February election. They also had a huge hole in the budget. They had no resources to cover that hole because the international community have cut all the aid because of the democratic backsliding, canceling the election results in Chisinau last year, and many other things, having political prisoners and all that. So they have no revenues to finance the budget. And that is a time bomb for the budget for the years to come. But then, here in Eastern Europe, we have this problem. In the US, you have a huge budget deficit, but you're in a slightly more advantageous position. Here, if you have a huge budget deficit, that's a recipe for economic disaster in the long run, because the price for credit will increase, the economy will enter into a spiral of negative growth. It's not sustainable. But then, it's electoral cycle before the election. You need to provide handouts to voters because you don't have probably anything else to sell to the voters as for your record in government. For instance, Dodon has been in power for 3 years. Not sure if you follow Moldovan politics closely. I mean, is there anything that he delivered on out of his agenda, or what's anything that he promised and he delivered to the voters?
So I'm not sure. So similar situation, though, I would bring up, I would inquire about, because I was talking with somebody here, an average person, I guess you would say, and I was asking them about what Plahotniuk did well, and because there's a lot of criticism coming at him, and I was saying, but I did see that he was going to fund, he did try to rebuild some of the infrastructure. Did he do that? There's you can criticize him for so much, but did they try to do some small stuff like that?
He tried to do that. That was his also rather populist agenda, to try to build infrastructure to show people that he is doing something. That is a noble cause. The only problem is that it was a rather cynical approach of building basically village roads from the church to the cemetery, or from the mayor's office to the church, or something like that.
So it was very government-oriented. It wasn't
very government-oriented, very political-oriented, to get political points at the local level, as opposed to if you want to develop the country. I mean, you don't have to be a PhD in economics to know that if you want to develop a country like Moldova, you need to build national roads. You need to build highways. If you want to connect, Gagauzia to Chisinau and to Belts, you need to have good national roads.
What's the new bridge that was just opened up? I believe the OSCE kind of tried to help facilitate that. I don't know.
That's a political stunt.
That's another political stunt.
To improve relations with Transnistria. It helps a bit.
They sold it on being a transportation route.
Yeah, it helps a bit. It's a good cause, but it's not a deal breaker. It's nothing major. It's good in terms of confidence building and improving slightly transportation, but it's not key in terms of strategic infrastructure in Moldova. But if you want to actually meaningfully develop Moldova, you need to build national infrastructure. You need to improve airports, which arguably has been done, but at huge costs. Basically sold out the airport as opposed to keeping it. It's a strategic asset. It's a huge, long story there.
Have a strong interest in that, I believe.
Well, it's a long story there. Giurgiulești port and another Mărculești airport. But it's national roads. If you want to have investment into the country, if you want to have companies bring here, outsource stuff here, they need to have roads. It doesn't help an international company, a Fortune 500 company, that you have a good road in the village from the cemetery to the church.
Yeah, they need good roads everywhere.
They need roads. They need national roads first and foremost. It's nice to have slightly better roads in the villages, of course, but from a perspective of national development, that's not a priority. From a political perspective of getting votes, yes, that is a priority. So it's a matter of political expediency.
Well, because I do remember last year when I was here, because I spent last winter here during the parliamentary elections, and I just came back for another 3 months or so. But I did see, I believe it was last year I saw that Dodon was encouraging people to move back to the villages, and to a certain extent that he was going to try to make village life better. Do you remember that message? Or?
Well, that's just
bullshit. Okay.
Have you been in Moldovan villages?
I've been on the outskirts of Chisinau.
Well, that doesn't count. You should check out Moldovan villages. When I was campaigning, and I was campaigning in the outskirts of Chisinau because I won the district in the suburbs of Chisinau. And I had for one day a Japanese journalist come with me from a major Japanese newspaper. And man, he had an experience walking the mud, you know, in the villages and seeing the sheer poverty even around Chisinau.
Yeah.
The villages are just a desolate place.
Yeah.
And there is, to be completely honest with you, yes, villages need to be revamped, but the future is in towns and cities.
Mm-hmm.
That's where the jobs are.
It's always been like that too. I mean,
And that's a movement. It's a global movement. You can't change that. I mean, look at China. Look at, you know, Western European countries have mostly been urbanized long before. It's nice to have nice villages like you have in the Alps, in Bavaria, in Austria. It's very nice. But that only happens when you have cities like Munich and Vienna, and that's when you can afford to have villages like those in the Alps.
Right.
And whereas in Moldova, we have poor cities. I mean, even Chisinau, look at Chisinau infrastructure, it's the capital. If you look at the budget of Chisinau, it's 200 million euros, 200 something million dollars. That's peanuts for a city of almost 1 million with all the people around it.
Okay, if you don't mind, so we kind of got carried on there, got into some really good material, stuff that's directly relevant to what I'm kind of researching. But I did want to kind of step back briefly and kind of look at you as a politician in Moldova a little bit. If you don't mind me asking, do you have like a little bit of your personal background? Because I mean, I noticed, I did a little bit of research before, you know, the interview, and I noticed that you were born in Kira, in this, the
Moldovan identity is very complicated.
Yes.
Some people see themselves as Moldovan, some see themselves as Romanian. We have a large Russian and Ukrainian community. We
Yes.
have a Gagauz community, Bulgarian community, Jewish community,
Mm-hmm.
a Roma community. In a democratic country, you should not only allow but encourage people to identify themselves the way they see fit.
Right.
And the language issue is another problem. The
Yes.
vast majority of Moldovans see the language as Moldovan, even though it's obvious to anyone that it is Romanian.
With a few Russian words mixed in, and even some...
No, the Russian words mixed in are not part of the Moldovan language. There is no Moldovan language to begin with. It's the Moldovan dialect, the Romanian language.
Okay.
And the Russian words are just, I mean, I can use Russian words while speaking in English as well. It doesn't mean that that is a different language.
Right, well, and there's so many words that really do cross over. You just say it different with a different accent, and it's the same.
That's the dialect. That's the dialect. The Russian words in the Moldovan dialect of the Romanian language are just words. They're not part of the language.
Mm-hmm.
I mean, if you'd spend 10 years in Moldova, you'd have a very different kind of English. There are some Americans who have spent a lot more time in Moldova,
Right.
and their English has a lot of Russian words.
Like they adopt new vocabulary.
Exactly. But then, I mean, it's still English.
Mm-hmm.
So in terms of identity, Moldovans have a very, very difficult history. But it's obvious that the language is Romanian,
Mm-hmm.
and those that feel the need to identify as Romanian need to be not only allowed but encouraged to do that. Those that still prefer to identify as Moldovan also need to be allowed to do that. I'm not sure if they need to be encouraged, because that was a pressure from the Soviet Union to try to create a distinct nation.
Mm-hmm.
Moldovans distinct from Romanians, which was a political move.
Yes.
On behalf of Moscow, on behalf of Russia, to basically create this single homogeneous Soviet nation.
Mm-hmm.
And try to dilute all the ethnic nations with groups from other countries. That's why they brought many Russians, Ukrainians here, especially in the cities, imposed Russian language. So that's the history of Moldova, and it's not something that you can fight with. I mean, you could, arguably in the early 90s, adopt a stance that the Baltic countries have adopted, and to basically evict or try to evict all the Russians, because not even the Baltic states would have evicted all the Russians. But then you would have had to ask the question, what is the cost for the economy?
Yes.
Because if the cost would have been acceptable for the political elites, maybe they would have thought about it. But then also the cost for integrity of the country,
Mm-hmm.
because Gagauzia would have likely drifted apart. Transnistria as well.
Is Transnistria industrialized to a certain extent where they have...
Transnistria is more industrialized than the rest of Moldova, and that was another purposeful policy by Moscow, by the USSR, to industrialize more the left bank of the Dnistru than Moldova proper. And I mean, they've created the autonomous Soviet Moldovan Republic in 1924 on that side, sort of to reclaim, because the place where we are now in the interwar period was part of Romania.
Right.
And in 24, the Russians created the autonomous republic, or USSR, I should say, created the autonomous Soviet Moldovan Republic to have this sort of, to cast a legitimate, in their view, claim over the rest of Moldova. And in 1940, with the beginning of the war, in 1994, at the end of the war, they basically reclaimed Moldova, reconquered it. They call it liberation from the Germans, from the fascist regime, but then the Romanians call it occupation by the Soviet regime. So one part of the
Ribbentrop-Molotov, the Ribbon, what was that? The treaty that the Nazis and the Romanians.
Yeah, Ribbentrop-Molotov Pact, yes.
Yeah, pact. All right, so, well, I mean, yes, or did you want to, I'm sorry, I didn't mean to interrupt you.
No, I mean, part of my experience, just like many other Moldovans, is growing up bilingual, and then having had the experience of studying in the US, I now speak English better than I speak Russian, unfortunately, because, I mean, the Russian language is a good skill to have. I also studied in Turkey for a year on a European Union grant, and I still regret to this day that I didn't learn Turkish better, because that would have helped me quite a bit in my communication with our Gagauzian compatriots.
How close is Gagauz to
It's
Turkey?
very close.
Turkish.
It's Turkish with some Russian words.
Okay.
It's not just that. It's slightly different, but I mean, if you speak Turkish well, you'd be able to find common ground with the Gagauzians. After graduation, I worked for the NATO Center, and afterwards, I was fortunate enough to get a job at the political section of the American Embassy, where I enjoyed doing what I learned in the university, political analysis. I mean, I did also many other things at the embassy of more technical, logistical nature, which I didn't quite enjoy, and that's the nature of the game. But political analysis was something that I really enjoyed doing, and getting to learn the ins and outs of Moldovan political system, getting to know the decision-making process, getting to know the intricacies of the corrupt elites and how things are actually run. When I would go and I would meet together with the ambassador, all the Moldovan politicians, after a while it was so redundant, because I could tell the ambassador in the car on the way to the meeting everything that the guys are going to say. Because I mean, after you've met them once or twice and you've heard their
position,
then you know, it's like a comedian, or the same
jokes every time, or
the same material.
Same material.
So, but that was an incredible learning experience about the Moldovan political system and Moldovan economic system and Transnistria. I was also responsible for Gagauzia, part of my portfolio. So I got a good hang of how things work and where the problems are.
Okay. Well, I guess we can just transition, because I did want to go back and dig a little deeper into your time at the U.S. Embassy, and I did notice that you had a focus on Gagauzia, and so. Well, and I'm also interested in your time at the NATO Documentation Center, but I think maybe the U.S. Embassy work might be more relevant to what we're trying to dig into here today. So Gagauzia and Transnistria, what do you see kind of as their economic strong points, or, I mean, just geopolitically speaking or economically speaking? Like even going back to Transnistria and being industrialized, I understand that, and I don't know if this is a benefit to Moldova, but most of what they produce still comes out, is sold with Moldovan, made in Moldova, like stamp on it.
Everything they
because they're not recognized.
They can't export.
So everything is Moldovan. It comes out of there. Does Moldova benefit from that? Or?
No. All the taxes remain in Transnistria.
Okay. And what about, I know this is another just controversial point, but I might as well touch on it real quick.
The gas issue?
The gas issue, the debt. What's going on with that?
Well, it's another curious situation in which Transnistria, or rather I should say Moldova, the state, well, it's not exactly state-run, that's the whole trick. We have a company, Moldova Gas Company, which used to be state-owned. But then in 1999, Russians acquired a majority stake in it, together with the Tiraspol Transgaz, which has around 17% shares. And Gazprom has about 35-ish, something like this. Together they have more than 50%. And when Moldova Gas buys gas from Russia, legally it's tricky whether it's actually Gazprom or it's actually Moldova. Gazprom says it's Moldova, Moldova says it's Gazprom. So Transnistria, Moldova buys gas for the whole country, including Transnistria, Moldova Gas.
Mm-hmm.
The vast majority of the gas is spent, roughly half, I guess, or even more than half, is spent by Transnistria, and mainly to produce electricity at the Kuchurgan power plant. The electricity they sell to us, to Moldova proper. Moldova proper pays Transnistria back for the gas. Or rather, I should say it pays Inter-AOS, the Russian electricity giant,
right,
which owns Kuchurgan, in a privatization that is questionable, to say the least. So when Moldova pays Transnistria or Inter-AOS, this is the main cash flow for Transnistria, the money that Moldova pays for electricity. The problem is that they don't pay for the gas. So the gas debt accrues for the gas that they use to sell the electricity for which we pay. So they spend the money that we pay them for electricity, but they don't pay the gas. So gas is basically a subsidy that the Russians are providing to the Transnistrian regime. And the total debt of Moldova Gas to Gazprom is about $7 billion, out of which only $500 million is the debt of Moldova proper, and about $6.5 billion is the debt of Transnistria, which is an insurmountable amount because it's almost like 80% of Moldovan GDP, which is impossible for Moldova to pay back.
So if Russia were to call in that debt, who would be responsible for that?
Well, that's the question. The Russians would argue that it's Moldova Gas, that is Moldova, and Moldova would argue strongly that given that the majority stakeholder in Moldova Gas is Gazprom, then it's basically Gazprom's problem. It'll likely end up in court, and in court, the problem is that
arbitration.
If it ends in arbitration, let's suppose arbitration rules in Moldova's favor. It's not, well, that decision of course would have been helpful. It's not guaranteed that it would rule in Moldova's favor. It might as well rule in Gazprom's favor. But if it rules in Moldova's favor, what happens if the Russians cut off gas to Moldova? Moldova has no gas alternative. So the dependence on Russian gas is the main vulnerability. Then this debt is the second vulnerability. But the main vulnerability is the 100% dependence on Russian gas. And the Moldovan economy is totally dependent on gas. In terms of the energy mix, gas is 70–80%.
Right, and that is a little tricky too, because I think the human rights international community kind of holds Moldova responsible for the actions in Transnistria, even though Moldova doesn't have direct control over activities in Transnistria. Is that kind of correct?
Well, it depends.
So they could extend that reasoning though to.
From a legal standpoint, of course, the European Court of Human Rights would have to hold Moldova liable for anything that happens in Transnistria, because Transnistria is, legally speaking, within Moldovan boundaries. But there were also cases before the European Court of Human Rights where Russia was also held liable.
Okay, yeah.
Russia was recognized as part of the situation.
Their de facto authority within Transnistria or something?
There were cases before the court where they, for instance, a Lashku case, a Moldovan political prisoner who was held in Transnistria, and several other cases where Russia was featured as a defendant along with Moldova.
Okay, so on this gas issue, one other point I wanted to touch on is, so I've heard that Romania is trying to build a pipeline north. Is that true? Is there, Romania is trying to build...
well, not necessarily north, in the center, Ungheni-Iași pipeline. That is a pipeline that should have been done long ago to connect Moldova to the European gas market. It's probably going to be finished next year, hopefully, but that pipeline can only cover about half of the country at most.
Okay.
The only alternative, feasible alternative, is another pipeline through the south that would connect to South Stream, also Russian gas, but another route so that it doesn't go through Transnistria. Because if it goes through Transnistria, Transnistrians can...
tax it? Or?
No, they can just take gas out of it.
Yeah.
You then have any control over the gas that comes to you. Whereas when you get the gas at the border with Romania, Moldova is in charge, and then Moldova will sell gas to Transnistria, and Transnistria will have to pay Moldova for the gas, as opposed to the gas coming from the east via Ukraine, via Transnistria, and only then it reaches Moldova. So Moldova has no leverage over the gas supply to Transnistria.
But with the current leadership, it could be argued that maintaining this relationship with the East is in their best interests?
Well, it's questionable. I mean, if we assume, which is a big if, that Dodon wants what's best for Moldova, then he will continue to pursue energy independence, or rather decrease Moldova's dependence on Russian gas. There is also the third energy package that needs to be implemented. Moldova is member of the European Energy Community, and they need to approve what's called the unbundling of energy infrastructure, so that the gas transportation infrastructure is a separate company, gas importing company is a different company, and the gas distribution delivery company is a different company. Whereas now it's Moldova Gas, well, technically the importing company is Energocom, a state-run intermediary. But then the distributor and the owner of the infrastructure is Moldova Gas, which is unfair because, I mean, not only is it not fair from a sort of economic standpoint, because the Moldova Gas is a monopolist and controls everything, and even if the gas comes from Romania, theoretically Moldova Gas can say, you know, forget it, we're not giving you the pipeline to distribute this gas to Moldovan customers. The same goes through any other potential provider, because once you are connected to the European energy market, theoretically you can buy gas from Norway, from, you know, pipeline from the Balkans.
And Moldova doesn't really have any energy resources at its disposal, does it? I mean,
well, solar energy is possible. Biomass, the European Union is helping us quite a bit with biomass to try to ramp up production of biomass, but that's not realistic to be able to replace gas. It can sort of slightly improve the energy mix in favor of renewables, but it's unlikely in the near future to replace gas as the main energy source.
With an agenda to grow at a certain rate, the oil demand is not going away.
Well, it's not the oil, it's gas.
Yes.
We need to, I mean, renewables, we need to improve on that. The problem is that hydro is problematic. Ukrainians want to build some new hydroelectric units in the north on the Dnistru, and that can provide huge ecological costs downstream. Yeah. That's problematic. Wind may be an opportunity. Yeah, solar and wind could be exploited, but it's also costly and it's problematic. But it's probably the way forward, because now the energy in the solar, the wind and the solar is decreasing in price in terms of, you know, implementing it. But in the short and medium term, gas will not be able to be replaced in the Moldovan energy mix. So that's why you just need to at least decrease your dependence on the single source, because we, until now, well, still are dependent on one provider of energy, that is Russia. We are dependent on one transit country, that is Ukraine. And we are dependent on one company that owns everything and his distributor, holds the infrastructure, triple dependency. That is not sustainable. That's an incredible vulnerability. So you need to decrease your sources of energy, your transit routes, and you need to unbundle the situation in the country if you want to decrease the vulnerability in terms of energy.
Yeah, and for Moldova being kind of relatively landlocked, I think you guys have one seaport, right?
It's a river port that is connected to the sea on the Danube.
But you guys are kind of in between two big countries, Romania and Ukraine, right? So you kind of have limited geographical options available to you.
Yeah, I mean, not as limited as Mongolia, but still.
But the pipeline from Romania is one potential option on the horizon that would decrease dependence quite a bit.
Yes, and it should have been done long ago. And another infrastructure project with Romania is the interconnection on high voltage electricity line through the south of the country in order to have an alternative, because now 80% of Moldovan electricity comes from Kuchurgan, this one power plant in Transnistria, and that's not sustainable. So connecting to the European electricity market via Romania is something that is also incredibly important to reduce the vulnerability in the electricity market.
Okay, so I think we are running a little low on time, so I just wanted to kind of end on this question or this topic. Back to you and your present activities in government. So as you move into this position, or you retain your position of Deputy Speaker, what is your agenda in politics right now? Do you have like 2 or 3, talking points, or your 3 issues that you are consistently behind?
Well, for us, the most important agenda is everything connected to European integration, harmonization of Moldovan legislation to the European acquis, implementation of the association agreement with the European Union and the deep and comprehensive free trade area. Basically anything that helps us to advance on our European integration agenda. That's part of my portfolio. And next week I'm going to Tbilisi for the Euronest meeting, the Parliamentary Assembly of the European Union Parliament and the parliaments of the 6 Eastern Partnership countries. And hopefully from there we'll start to push this new strategy of separating Moldova, Georgia and Ukraine from Azerbaijan, Armenia and Belarus, to have these 3 countries in a much more advanced position in their relationships with the European Union. That's an agenda that I'll be promoting. Then here locally, I mean, for me personally and for my party, it's important to have the Istanbul Convention ratified against violence against women and girls. And now we have 16 days of campaign against violence against women. And that is an agenda item that is very important for my party and for me, to promote gender equality, to promote human rights. We have a very active chairwoman of the Human Rights Committee, colleague of my party, Doina German. She's spearheading this effort, and I'm happy to support her in that regard. And it's rather ironic that our colleagues from the majority now, the Socialists and the Democrats, have just decided to take away the prerogatives of combating violence against women and domestic violence from the Committee of Human Rights and give it to the Social Affairs Committee, which is run by the Democrats, thus basically taking away this agenda item from us.
They took away the gender equality issue?
The domestic violence.
Domestic violence.
From the Human Rights Committee, because Doina was so vocal about it. She was so instrumental in shining light on this issue. That they figure out they'll take it away so that we don't cause too much trouble, and they can put it in in the drawer. And that's something that just rings yet another bells that Dodon's approaches are very similar to Plahotniuk's. Okay. That you try to carve out rules and try to sort of beat people into submission by this shenanigans where you just try to change the rules and to put people in a position where you basically silence them. Right. That's not something that is positive development. And one rule, if anything Moldovan history teaches us, is that, and this is a quote from Stanislav Secriero, prominent Moldovan analyst who works in Paris, I think, and he wrote an article for the Carnegie endowment saying that Moldovan political system is a graveyard for autocrats. And that indeed is a very apt metaphor. And if Dodon hasn't realized that yet, then I guess he may have a rude awakening in the near, or not so near, but hopefully near future.
Okay, so just 10 on a positive note. So your goal within politics, as Speaker, do you want to retain this position, or do you have a step further that you're looking to?
Well, I wasn't counting on the Deputy Speaker position. I'm happy with what I have. I try to make the most of the position that I'm in. I'm also the Deputy President of the party that I represent. I have a lot of work to do there. So if they vote me out of the Deputy Speaker position, it's not the end of the world. I have things to do. I've used this platform to promote an agenda of change that I see beneficial to my voters and to Moldova. I'll continue to do that regardless of the position.
Okay.
And,
all right. Deputy Speaker Mihail Popșoi, I want to thank you for taking the time to speak with me today. Thank you.
you're welcome. And happy Thanksgiving again.
Thanks.